I'm Rev Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Where are our prophets now? Where are those messages God chooses to communicate divine revelation through? In the past, the Creator has sent prophets like Abraham, Siddhartha, Jesus, Muhammad, and many more. Maybe our higher power has switched tactics since we reinterpret God's words as soon as the Creator's prophets leave us. Could it be that Spirit talks to each one of us individually and we haven't learned to listen? On Words of the Prophets, our modern prophets show us how to find the internal prophet that is the I Am, and we discuss the application of spiritual principles in all aspects of our lives.
Love and light, everybody. I'm Rev Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Today we have a special show with a special guest. My guest today is Bill O'Donnell. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks, Phil. It's good to be here.
Oh, it's good to have you. Those of you who are, I don't know where you might be, Bill is the host of Spirituality TV here on Santa Fe Community Television, Cable Access Channel 16. That's a station you're watching me on, just in case you didn't know that. Bill has actually two shows on. Well, let's talk about one of them first. Spirituality TV can be seen on Mondays at 7 p.m., on Thursdays at 9 a.m., and on Sundays at noon. And then we have another show that you just started, which is called Year of the Priest, and that's going to be on Fridays from 7 p.m. and on Sundays at 2 p.m. So you want to watch these shows because Bill has a lot of good stuff to say. Today's prophetic topic is a spiritual revolution. This topic comes from the book, The Essential Dalai Lama, which is copyrighted in 2005 and published by Penguin Books. We could take this topic from chapter 2, which is the quest for human happiness. It's on page 15, it's the last paragraph, and in part it reads as follows. Our problems, both those we experience externally, such as wars, crime, and violence, and those we experience internally, our emotional and psychological sufferings, cannot be solved until we address this underlying neglect. That is why the great movements of the last 100 years and more, democracy, liberalism, socialism, have all failed to deliver the universal benefits they were supposed to provide, despite many wonderful ideas. A revolution is called for, certainly, but not a political, an economic, or even a technical revolution. We have tried enough experience on these during the past century to know that a purely external approach will not suffice. What I propose is a spiritual revolution. And the reason I've chosen this topic with Bill as my guest is this man started a spiritual revolution 23 years ago with Spirituality TV. And in a lot of ways, I might not be here if it wasn't for what Bill had started. So the revolution is happening, and now we're just it's expanding. I've gotten a show, there's other shows on here, and watch this station. There's a lot of good shows on it, and they're dealing with all aspects of spirituality, which I believe, and I guess based upon the title of Bill's show, he believes as well, is the answer. But that's enough talking for me. Bill, how did you come to do Spirituality TV?
Well, by way of clarification, I actually got started in community television in Denver when I was living and working up there. And what typically happens historically was a cable company would come into town and they'd be bidding with the city or municipality to provide the service. And in Denver, I'll come to me the name of the company, and they provided free training to do community television up there. So I took that course, and but then shortly thereafter I moved down here. And it goes to the history of community television in Santa Fe, which is worth noting. A fellow by the name of Bill Richmond, who was a librarian for the city of Santa Fe, wrote a grant and decided to start it on his own. And he did, and they were out of the Lafarge Library, and I came in at the right time and helped him because I just learned how to do it, and so we did a little bit then. And then he left, and the thing just fell into kind of a no man's land for about 7 years. And then it came back in formal community television with Comcast Cable, I presume. And I met Jonathan Lowe, who was a doing videography there, had started his show called Healing in Santa Fe, and he found out that I was working and studying with the late Dr. Shear, the famous naturopathic physician, and he wanted Dr. Shear to be on television. I wanted him to be on as well, so he asked me to host the show, and we did a two-parter interview with Dr. Shear at his old office on Mackenzie, and it was a great beginning of a relationship. Then I did 10 years of hosting and associate producer for that show, Healing in Santa Fe and the Art of Healing. That lasted 10 years, and right out of this studio we presented it. And so then I did a couple other little ones, and then Spirituality TV has only been on for 15 years.
Okay.
Sorry, it's a long story, but that's
good.
Want to get the history right.
Why Spirituality TV? What got you into
Another
it?
good question. I've been interested in spirituality, I'm sure, my whole life. I mean, just aware of something behind our eyes, something below the surface. And so when I came, and I had an extensive kind of a New Age and metaphysical background, and we go into that later, but I subsequently got involved with the Santa Fe Institute for Spirituality, then at the College of Santa Fe, with Brother Brian Dabowski, and we were both guests on your show. That's how I met you. Was on your radio show some years ago. And
7 years, if you could believe
it. Was it 7? No, I can't. So then I decided, well, I was frustrated because I was doing a lot of the programming. I was bringing speakers in, and we were having great programs, but not that many people were able to come, typically just during the summer. So because of my experience with community television, I decided, well, why don't we take it to them? So I started Spirituality TV, sort of out of the Institute for Spirituality, but because I couldn't get enough of that type of programming, I broadened it to different types of spirituality.
Do you feel it was a calling?
In effect, I don't think I was conscious of that as a call, other than I remember as a little kid watching television at home with my family, and I was always fascinated by television. I think it's a great medium. However, you can't judge the medium by the content. And so I thought that the program we were doing at the Institute had good quality content and worthwhile things for people to say, and that people could benefit from it. So that was my motivation.
You chose a broad-based spirituality. Is that a reflection of your path?
Yeah, I guess, in retrospect, but it wasn't conscious. I mean, it just came out of the Institute for Spirituality, and I think the Institute actually got started, I think, originally at the old University of Albuquerque. It was a Catholic college, and they had this going there, this program, and when the Christian Brothers were asked to take it over, when the University of Albuquerque went away, it's now the site of the Catholic Center up on the Mesa and right next to St. Pius High School. Great setting. I mean, beautiful views.
Before my time. So it started off as predominantly Catholic Christian based. Would that be a fair statement? Yeah.
The way the Catholic Church works, as I understand it, you usually have a bishop of the region, which is called then the diocese. And in our case, we have an archbishop, currently held by Archbishop Michael J. Sheehan, who is, I think, maybe the 11th or something archbishop. And so technically, everything that's Roman Catholic is technically under him, even if we're just volunteers. And he actually was an ex officio member of that particular board of directors and was totally supportive, providing education. But we went far afield than just traditional Catholic teachings during the 23 years that Institute's been in existence today.
Let's go back to your background. How did you start off life? As a Catholic, or did you start off somewhere else, and where did your wanderings take you?
Well, if we start in the human dimension, I was born...
It's a good place as any.
Yeah, I was born to Bernard and Jane O'Donnell. I was the third son in a row, and then later my sister and younger brother came, so I was the middle of 5 children, and I was born and raised in a town in the north tip of the San Francisco Bay in California called Vallejo. However, I found out when I moved to New Mexico that that's not the proper pronunciation, because the town was actually named after the famous last Governor General of Alta California, Generalissimo Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, the last Governor General of Alta California, and but I learned all that once I got here.
After the fact. So what was the spiritual practice, if any, in the house?
You know, in those days, and we're fairly close in age, you know, in that post-World War II era, my two older brothers were born during the war, and I came along after. You know, it was a lot like what you see on television. You know, it was a lot different. I think that families, I think they were just adjusting, because my parents and probably yours were raised in the Depression. And they came out of that. Their parents went through World War I, then our parents came during World War II. And they went through that, and they were just trying to, you know, get used to civilian life and the war being over, which was a major, World War II was a major thing, as you can imagine. And so I think they were pretty laissez-faire about it. It was go to church on Sunday kind of a thing. But they did send us to parochial school. And so I went to a school called St. Basil the Great Grammar School, and I didn't learn until I came here that St. Basil was the father of Eastern monasticism. And you know, think of Russia in nowadays, but
yeah.
in that area, you know, Eastern Europe and Russia and that sort of thing, St. Basil. And then later, as you may recall, I got the call and became a Benedictine at Pecos, New Mexico, along the Pecos River. And Benedict was the father of Western monasticism. So I've had some fortunate experiences that influenced me, I would say.
Did you find that growing up, the religion you got exposed to, the spiritual practice you got exposed to, did you get any fulfillment out of it?
Fulfillment's an interesting question. I mean, what do you know when you're going to grammar school? You know, I started grammar school in kindergarten. We wore distinctive outfits. We wore these charcoal gray, white flecked corduroys, and a white shirt, and a maroon cardigan sweater with the SBS kind of a thing here. And so all the boys wore that, and I forget what the girls, same thing on top, they wore some type of skirt. I can't remember what the...
Must have been plaid.
Probably was a plaid. You know, it's funny, I can't remember what that was. But in any case, so we just wore all the same clothes. There's certain advantages when all the kids are dressed the same. It really is. And so I don't have any complaints. All at the time, though, man, I was bored to death and tired of it. And so I was happy to get out of it. But I think it was all right for me in formation. And they gave us the rudiments of Christianity.
And did you see that having any practical demonstration or application in the world?
Well, maybe your conscience was higher than mine, but in grammar school it was all about just, you know, who am I and what are we doing, and, you know, with grade after grade. And I think more in terms of, I was sort of maybe a little bit of a late bloomer in terms of reading, because I didn't really pick up on it until about the third grade, and it was comic books that taught me how to read. I give credit, because I'd look at the comic books and I'd be attracted to them, and pretty soon it was like the words started jumping out at me, and I literally went from the D group to the A group in 1 year, and I give credit to the Justice League of America and Marvel Comics, and later than Classics Illustrated and things like that. Does that ring a bell?
Ring a bell. That's how I got through most of my term papers, was classic comics. Just to tell you, give you an idea how, I don't know what the phrase I want to use, but how antisocial I was as an early age. My favorite comic book character was the Silver Surfer.
Okay.
Because you just floated on your surfboard, toured the galaxy, nobody messed with you. Every now and then you did a job for Galactus, and then you were on your own again. And to me, that was like the ultimate freedom.
That's interesting. So it's almost analogous to like a different religion, isn't it?
I think so.
Because I only knew of the Silver Surfer, but it never crossed my path. I was more of a Justice League, you know, Superman,
that
Batman.
Was a DC Comics as opposed to Marvel.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Flash, Green Lantern.
Yeah.
Who am I missing?
Say Batman?
Yeah, I think so.
Aquaman?
Didn't put Aquaman in there. How about Wonder Woman? Even
Wonder Woman coming next, yeah.
Who else was in that group?
That's pretty much about it, I think. That was my pecking order, was Marvel Comics first. When I finished them, my next was DC Comics. Then I went to Archie's. And when I ran out of that, and it was always Mad Magazine.
Yeah.
And then there was always the Classic Comics when I had to read something like Tale of Two Cities. I wasn't going to read that, so I read the...
Yeah, I did the same thing. Although later I saw it with Ronald Colman, and boy, it was a great movie.
Never saw the movie.
In the 30s. They just played on AMC or something. Turner Classroom. But, I want to give, and also credit, because I did go to a public nursery school. I should say that was my first experience, going to nursery school. And then after that, it was straight, Catholic education through the 8th grade, predominantly given by St. Joseph of Carondelet nuns. They wore the black habit and then the white thing here and the white breastplate. And that's all I knew. I didn't know any different until I got to junior high.
Yet, from my understanding, part of your path wandered through Hinduism. How did that happen?
Much later. When I went off to college, well, first of all, let's set the stage for the modern era. Pre-1969, post-high school education for men was dominated by something called the draft, right?
Uh-huh.
And so you were subject to the draft up to 1969. The fall of 69, I believe, the lottery came in. So think about it. Every guy who was relatively healthy was subject to this. So if you didn't go to college and get what was called a 2S deferment, you were going to be drafted, period. That's just the way the game was played, unless you had some type of draft deferment. Now, I grew up in a town that was the home of Mare Island Naval Shipyard, the oldest naval installation on the West Coast. We got there. My grandfather came there from San Francisco. He was a native of San Francisco, California. His father was the immigrant. Parents probably both immigrants from Ireland. And he came there to be the master boilermaker. And so that was a job that a lot of my friends took. They became apprentices on Mare Island Naval Shipyard, which was a deferred position because that was military industrial complex, I guess. And so otherwise you went to college. And so, boy, I was just looking forward to going to college. But I ended up going to local community college, which was literally kind of a bummer place. It wasn't a very nice place. The subsequent one they built was quite nice, but this wasn't. But just getting out of high school was a blessing. I was real tired of high school by the time I was finished. And enjoyed it. I enjoyed high school too, but the consciousness wasn't really evolving there. And I think my goal in life, as I look back on it, I just wanted to get out of town to experience something different than what I had experienced growing up.
And what did you experience?
Well, studying things like anthropology and things like that were quite different than the typical things you learn in high school. I enjoyed those things, but I was mostly interested in social life and sports. I played sports in high school, football, basketball, and even did a stint on the tennis team. And I got my first varsity letter. I was the track statistician. I enjoyed track, but I didn't have any skills, so went along as a statistician, and my older brother threw the discus. And so it was more of a social thing. High school was something you did, and it was more social. Then going to college is a little different, because now you're starting to think about what you're going to do, and you're really preparing to go on to something else. At least that was my experience. And to stay in school so you're not drafted. So you had to take at least 12 units a semester, and you had to keep at least a C average, that sort of thing. So looking back, I think that was really the kind of the spinal column of my consciousness at the time. So the spiritual stuff really didn't come until later.
Just kind of tasting what was on the smorgasbord?
Yeah, but then when I went off to college, my older brother Dick, I was accepted at the University of California at Davis to go bio-sci, pre-med, but they wouldn't accept about a quarter's worth of my units from Solano College, which is now Solano College. And I was devastated because I knew that if, that way I wouldn't finish on time, and I may not get the extra time to finish in a rigorous discipline like pre-med. And so I made what I thought was the rational decision to go to San Jose State, where I had also applied, and study business. Because I hadn't really planned to do it. It was just like a backup thing. I did it. In those days, it cost like $10 to apply for a college. It didn't cost anything. And it was a kind of a backup situation in case I didn't get into Cal. And So as a result of that, I was ended up at San Jose State, but it was a blessing because I got to meet a guy by the name of Professor Jack Holland. And Jack introduced me to a lot of things, but the first thing was parapsychology. Are you familiar with that?
Yep.
Okay. That's what opened my mind.
And where did that lead?
Gee, it just went, you'll love this story. Jack, so I joined this fraternity. I joined the fraternity Alpha Tau Omega. And it was funny because I couldn't get into his class before I became a pledge. And the guy says, don't worry, just go put your pledge pin on and go back and see him. And he saw I was a pledge and let me in his class. It was so full. He taught management. And then he just kind of handpicked what I think in retrospect were more of the kind of seeker types of the fraternity. So about a half dozen of us were invited to his house, and we sat on the floor, and in came this guy in a white short sleeve shirt and tie, clean cut, and he sat down and closed his eyes and just sat there. Well, I had just heard the term meditation. This is back in the 60s, and I just heard the term meditation, and then he meditated for a few maybe a couple of minutes, and then he started to speak. I was listening to him, and I leaned over to the guy next to me and I says, "It doesn't seem like he's the guy that's talking."
Uh-huh.
What turned out to be channeling.
Uh-huh.
I'd never, can you imagine? That was the perfect response. It doesn't seem like he's the guy that's talking. And he was a doctor of some kind, a chiropractor named McKinney. And I mean, going home to the fraternity house that night, all six of us, we didn't say a word. So I saw Dr. Holland the next week, and I says, "Hey, Jack," I says, "can you recommend a book for me that kind of opened me up this?" And he not only recommended, he bought it for me. He was looking for The Morning of the Magicians by Powles and Bergère, a couple of scientists who looked at a lot of these odd things in life, and they were scientists and gave it a scientific approach to it. And it began my reading of different things. And that went from there. I started studying Buddhism, Zen Buddhism with Alan Watts, reading different things. I even read Dianetics by your buddy.
L. Ron Hubbard.
L. Ron Hubbard. I shouldn't say your buddy, but you just start reading these things because, God, what's this, And so just reading, that introduced me to Buddhism. And Hinduism, I guess I have to give credit to Richard Alpert, better known as Ram Dass. Because after then I graduated from college and I had a couple of spiritual experiences. I ran into his book, Be Here Now, and that really turned me on. Here's a Jew, turned me on to Hinduism.
Let me back up for a second. This person who was doing the channeling, did he claim to be channeling anybody in particular?
I don't recall, actually. I mean, I'm
Okay.
saying it doesn't seem like he's the guy that's talking. I was still amazed at the phenomena.
I've had those experiences. In fact, there's one of my sections on my website is it's called Chet Lau's Virtues, and Chet is TCH, and the second name is LAO, and that was a series of channeled sessions, and you could hear, him talking because they're all audio files, but I've had a lot of experience with channels, and for the most part, I felt most of them, my gut was telling me most of them were fake. But there was a couple of them. Chet was one of them, and there was a woman I had on my show a few years ago who lives in Austin, Texas, who channels the Abraham group, who I also, that feeling, this is authentic, this is real. But I know that what you were talking about, that first experience of the reality, because I had experienced a few people prior who was like, they're phony. You could just sense it. There was like they were channeling their own personality.
Yeah, that gets into a touchy area because I've since experienced a lot of channels, and I don't think I ever met somebody just flat out making it up. Now their delivery may be fallacious or phony, but I've experienced clairaudience, and so I know that voices do exist and come from the other side in many different forms. So my advice to people would be to give them the benefit of the doubt and just check your own guidance and your intuition as to whether or not they have anything of value for you. And I'll quote the Old Testament for that one. There's what's that famous, basically, if you're hearing, something. And I forget who the famous guy was. I want to say it was Samuel, but the prophet Samuel. And this is the Word of the Prophet show, so I guess it's okay to talk about them. And he is a young man. I forget who his teacher was, and he was hearing these voices. And he'd go back and he'd wake up to his teacher and says, "You called me." He says, "No, I go back to bed." Same thing happened. He called me. No. And the third time, the guy realized, hey, God is obviously trying to talk to you. So just listen, say, "Here I am, Lord, I'm listening." And so there is this inner hearing thing that I think that everyone really needs to be conscious of, in a sense. So, because on the other hand, there are people who go crazy from hearing voices. And I've had that experience too as a lawyer. I graduated from law school and I was clerking for a firm, and a woman called the firm looking for help and said, "Anybody want to talk to a kook?" I said, "Well, I'll talk to her." And this woman had been hearing voices. She checked herself into a mental facility in California, and they found out she had insurance, and they wouldn't let her go. And she just wanted some help. They didn't give her any help. They just drugged her to kind of relax her so she wouldn't be. And they kept her because it was a cash flow situation. So I knew enough to have her contact, I think it was the public defender, who actually is like an ombudsman for people who are mentally ill to protect their rights. So, there's a lot we could talk about on that subject.
Well, in that subject, though, I mean, there's a whole history of the church persecuting people who were having these experiences and calling them witches and stuff. And I mean, so how I'm not that familiar with the whole process, but how does that evolve if there's, basically covered in the Bible that says, yes, you could, this is perfectly all right. Why? How did it evolve? Do you know how it evolved into where we persecuted people?
Well, yeah. I mean, have you ever persecuted anybody?
All the time but that's a whole other story.
Yeah, but you see, there's that kind of influence here. So let me just, I'm going to refer to the New American. I brought my own because it's got the marks in it and stuff, but before I do that, I'll remember 2/3 of this book is Jewish, right? It's all Jewish to me. I mean, the whole thing.
Yeah.
Okay. People forget that Jesus is Jewish. He wasn't a Christian. He wasn't a Catholic. He wasn't a Protestant. He's Jewish. The whole thing's Jewish. All the apostles were Jewish. I assume that most of the writers were Jewish. But in any case, that was the example, the first example in the Old Testament. And I can't remember the book. If I was prepared, I want to say 1 Kings or something like that. But that's the story of inner hearing and listening. And there's all kinds of references to people having experiences of discorporate beings, which we might call angels, angels often then appear as human beings. And this book is loaded with those stories. Angelology. I remember when I had the Archbishop in here, Archbishop Sheehan, and I asked him to talk about angels, and he confirmed it there. And I've had other priests, the monks from Christ the Desert, talk about the angels, and the nuns at Pecos and others, they all talk about it. They won't offer it, but if you ask them, they'll confirm this. So what's an angel? And when I was a kid, I was taught that we all have a guardian angel. Were you taught that?
No.
Okay. Well, it was a normal thing in Catholicism when you're given a leg up in spirituality and consciousness because you're taught as a little kid, you have a guardian angel. What does that mean? You're never alone. There's a spirit being with you all the time, and they are directly connection with you and God. What do you think of it now?
Well, I want to back this up, not just in the conversation,
okay,
but I mean, in the years you've done shows, you've probably had experiences with shamanism.
Sure.
I mean,
well, more in personal experience than on shows.
I mean, okay. I mean, and shamanism basically is about that connection.
Yeah, pretty much.
So I mean, what we're talking about here, as I see it, is that there is some common beliefs given different names that all have teaching the same thing. How do you feel about that? Yeah.
Well, what's our goal here? I mean, our goal, I think in Christianity, what I've been taught is your connection with God. We are taught that we are children of God. We are made in the so-called image and likeness of God. We're children of God. Now, some people would just say, well, we're God. Well, if my father's O'Donnell, I'm O'Donnell. So there's this analogy, that kind of thing. And that my mother married in and she became an O'Donnell. And I'm a product of both both lines and that sort of thing. So that's the analogy that comes to mind about that. And and Jesus taught, he says, you have to seek, knock, and you have to ask. If you don't seek, you won't find. If you don't knock on it and go after it, the door won't be open to you. And if you don't ask, you won't receive. So if people, we have a duty, I think, a spiritual duty to seek, to knock, and to ask. Those are the action words.
Okay. And is that the basis of the show that you've been doing?
Basically, I think my show is not as conversational as this one, in that this show is Spirituality TV is directly related to the guest and what the guest has to offer. If I've got a Roman Catholic priest on there, we're going to talk about him as a being, as a human being, as a man, how he got the call, what's it about, what can you tell us about this sort of thing? What are the benefits of the church in that regard? As I told you when I had the Muslim gal on, I told her in advance I want to hear every good thing you've ever seen, witnessed, thought about Islam. Because personally, I'm sick to death of what the typical media covers about Islam. It's usually highly slanted, and there's got to be some benefits to it, or it wouldn't be growing. So my own experience when I was a member of the Interfaith Council here some years ago in Santa Fe, I think it's a different group now, but we took a field trip, and Shirley Green's a guy that reminds me, some other people, some mostly Protestant driven, and they arranged for us to go up to Abiquiu, to the Dar es Salaam mosque. I'd never been to a mosque, and they were telling us about it. Then it came time to pray. Well, everything stops, man. 5 times a day, time to pray. So they invite us, if you want to come, you can. I thought, well, and I remember there was a priest named Jenko, Father Jenko, in the spirit of Father Jenko. He was captured in Lebanon when they first started, taking prisoners or hostages, and so he was in a prison captured for over a year, and so he got up to pray with his captors, and that was the guidance I needed to say, okay, sure, I'll get up and pray with you, and we did, and there was only a handful of us that did it, and I remember this because I'll never forget it. There was a fellow there, their religion instructor was a guy named Ahmed Alalu, something. He was Egyptian, and he was the religion educator up there. And he saw those of us who got up and prayed with the rest of them, he gifted us with a hardbound, beautiful Quran that had to be, retail at least $25, I would imagine, if you went to buy it. And on one side is Arabic, and the other side is English, and wonderful footnotes. And I was so touched. I was just reading the Bible for the first time at that time, this in the 80s, and I said, I'll read this. And so as soon as I finished the Bible, I waited a day and I picked this thing up, and 9 months later, I had read the Quran, and I had a whole different perspective on Islam.
What did you learn from it?
Well, first of all, that it wasn't irrational for the main part. I didn't seem irrational, but the footnotes were extraordinary, Phil. It was. I learned, they refer to Christians and Jews as the same thing. They're both people of the book.
Yes.
They make no distinctions, and I thought, well, that's interesting, and. About the praying 5 times, and it's been a long time since I've read it, but without having read it, I wouldn't have been interested really in pursuing the interview. And my goal, when I was asked why, this former Catholic guy who used to run the channel here asked me, what's your goal in doing the show? And I said, convert everybody to Islam. That's what I said. I said that, and the girl who was there, the gal, well, if that's the case, I'm getting up. I said, no, you don't understand. That's just the attitude I take in hosting this program, because the program is designed to encourage people in their spiritual life.
Exactly.
And it's not my job to tell them what they have to do. I mean, I say it's not my job to convert the Dalai Lama. I think he's doing a pretty good job where he is, that sort of thing.
And that's, let's back up to the topic,
Sure.
A spiritual revolution.
Okay.
And I think that's how it starts. And I really believe that what you've been doing is so important. I believe that what I'm doing is divine in its nature. I could tell some stories about it, but I really have no doubt that this is God's will for me. And that I'm here to carry this message, and my message might come slightly different than yours, but it's basically the same thing. That we're each spirit and find a way to connect to that spirit. So over all these years that you've been doing it, who have been your most influential guests? Who have been the highlights, the heroes?
Wow. Well, I don't know how to answer that because each one has been a blessing. And remember, I did 10 years with Jonathan on his show.
Uh-huh.
So the art of healing and healing in Santa Fe was close to my heart as well. And I got him to go out with me to the Benedictine Monastery in Pecos, and I was able to, because I was interested in spiritual healing. And so we got to interview when Abbot David, the first abbot out there, was retiring and moving to California to the Monastery of the Risen Christ. He came out. I mean, Jonathan and I came out and we interviewed tons of people that day. And we edited down to basically the normal half-hour show with the one kind of catch question was, what healings had you seen here? And I tell you, Phil, at the time it was extraordinary because, I mean, everybody was talking about mainly their own healings, what had happened to them, which is the right thing to do. Talk about that. I mean, one of the guys had been hit by lightning twice, turned his hair to blonde, Brother Daniel Stromera, and, and he talked about people, they prayed over him and he got well. I mean, it was amazing. So there are a lot of great stories, and they're all on tape. So someday I'll have to get a highlight reel. You and I have kidded each other about a highlight reel, and to put it, or maybe get it on a website somewhere. I'd love to see that one on. But that was one of my first in the spirituality vein. But also later, I also did some videotaping at the Institute for Spirituality, and there was a priest by the name of Father Robert de Grandis, who came, very famous in charismatic circles, which are the gifts of the Spirit, manifesting the gifts of the Spirit, and he taught them. I mean, you've heard of praying in tongues? Mm-hmm. Well, it looks like jive until you experience it. Now, I was there one of the first times I'm at Pecos, and all of a sudden it was at a moment where people started spontaneously praying in tongues, and I'm like, all of a sudden I noticed my tongue started to wag. I go, okay, my tongue's wagging, what do I do? And so I just sort of intoned, and it just took off. And now I'm praying in tongues. Now, if you read the New Testament, in St. Paul's writings, he doesn't make a big deal out of praying in tongues. But de Grandis came and he taught me, his only real teachings I had about it. He gave us a week at the Institute for Spirituality, and he taught people how to pray in tongues. And what it does, interestingly enough, is I believe it suspends judgment. Your mind is a very strong tool, and it's going to clamp down on things. It doesn't sound right, it doesn't feel right, or whatever, and can block things. And he found that if people learned to pray in tongues first, it would open them up to other gifts of the spirits. And that includes prophecy, translating, healing, all kinds of things can come. That I think we have latent abilities, and you'd probably agree, we have latent abilities that haven't really been developed because the wisdom schools that they talk about archetypally are not readily available.
So if I hear you correctly, what we're talking about is what guides the mind. Is it self? Is it ego? Is it emotions? Is it intellect? Or is it spirit?
What do you think?
Well, I think what's happening and what should be happening are two different things. I think most people are guided by the lower parts of themselves and not by spirit. Mm-hmm. And I believe that spirit makes anything possible. Mm-hmm. And I've witnessed healings. I've had people who have had amazing, immaculate recoveries from things they should not have. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I really, I stopped believing in the medical model over a course of time. To me, a lot of times they play God and they don't know what they're talking about.
Well, I'm chuckling for several reasons. My first thought in there, you're sounding very Christian Science to me, and my maternal grandmother was raised Christian Science, although she ended up high Episcopalian. And then the second thing that occurred to me was, my father was a medical doctor, and I learned a lot from him. But going back to your original point about how the mind, he was a general practitioner and surgeon in his hometown. He was a Navy doctor during World War II. And he also used to do part-time pathology to keep his hand in for surgery and make a few extra bucks for his large family of 5 kids. And so he did autopsies. So when I was about 14, I caught my dad and my older brother sneaking off, kind of just sneaking off. Well, not really sneaking, but just taking off. And so I went on the porch and said, hey, where are you going? And my dad says, we're going to go do a post, which meant a post-mortem. And I said, can I come? And he thought a second. He said, okay. So I knew my place. This was my older brother and my dad's deal, but I could sit in the back and just keep quiet. So I did. And it was quite an amazing experience to witness an autopsy, because a couple of things happened over years. When first of all, it's pretty eerie. Everybody can imagine that. I mean, you're walking into this beautiful mortuary, and you'd been there before for funerals, but you'd never gone down to this room, and you're down this hallway, and you go down the second to last door on the right, and you go into a door, and there's just nothing in there, but just a hallway and another door. It's a closed door, and you go down there, and you hit this buzzer. It's one of those ugly buzzers, like that, And honest to God, the guy who opened the door, bespectacled guy, kind of ashen face, wearing a white coat, and he literally said, "Good afternoon, doctor." And it wasn't even fake. He was Germanic, and I knew his daughter, and it was like, okay, But that was my big brother and my dad, so I'm not too worried. And then here are these two slabs covered with sheet, And the next thing he pulls this off, and here was this dead woman who I think had taken an overdose of pills or something, and been under her heating blanket for quite a while. She was almost green, not quite, but there was a green tinge. And I'm like, this is, it's a little rough at first. However, once he gowned us, put gloves on us and everything, and opened up, I'm telling you, there's nothing more fascinating than the inner workings of the human body. Mm-hmm. And what I realized, there's no greater evidence of divinity than the inner working of the human body. And one other, there's no greater evidence of the spirit or the soul in a human body, because one thing you're in there cutting a body, that the soul is gone. Mm-hmm. Now later, I kind of felt them around a lot, because if you think of Native American traditions and other traditions, they all subscribe to the feeling and belief, and maybe even the experience of the soul being around and quite readily available relatively soon after, when they leave the body. They just don't take off and they're gone forever. They're around. That's my experience. Anyhow, and so those two things became very clear. Now, the first and only time he ever did a cranium, where he took a blade and opened up the head, and then took out this brain and put it in my gloved hands. And I'm sitting there looking at it, and I heard a voice in my inner ear saying, "This is a bioreceiver." That was it. And so you ask where thoughts come from. So my belief, based on that experience, that hands-on experience, was that if you look at a brain too, that it's a bioreceiver. Now, I can't give you a full explanation of it, but I heard that when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
And it made the most sense to me of anything I've heard since.
Well, one of the things I believe is that the mind and the intellect are two separate. The mind runs the body, and so when you say the brain is a bioreceiver, I fully subscribe to that. What happens is, I think we confuse the two of them. And we add, I think, too much emphasis on intellect, where I think it's the lowest component we have. But that's a whole other story for another time. But I want to just back up for a second on this healing stuff. I mean, and I don't remember the exact passage, but Jesus said, "All this that I do, so shall ye, and even greater." And if he was raising the dead and healing the sick, then we all have that capability. And that was the basis of why I said, about the medical model. I think we learn to defer to people because we think they really know something more than we. And I'm thinking, no, wait a second. Jesus had a message here that we need to hear. That is, what do I believe?
That's true. Well, you're in luck, because right here, right here in this book is the principal work that they recorded what Jesus said, and they wrote it down. And I always like to quote my former abbot David Garrett's said that it's such a great story that they'd had to make it up if it wasn't true.
I agree.
Isn't that great?
I don't think they could have made it up. Those teachings were so advanced for that time.
Yeah.
It was beyond anybody to make up.
Yeah. So, but then again, if you go back to the Quran, Muhammad stated, or it's written in the Quran, that he believed he got all his information from the Archangel Gabriel. And if you recall, the Archangel Gabriel was the angel that came to Mary and said, "Hey, I got a deal for you," And so there is this, again, back to the angels as the communicators, as the bridge between, heaven and earth. And that if we are divine, and I believe we are, image and likeness of God, I mean, I just know that in some sense, that, we're a part of that. We are a part of God intimately and fully, even though we don't realize it. And Scripture says, too, we only know in part now.
Uh-huh. And if we put that in the context of just changing the name from God to Creator, and then we have that context that we have the ability to create.
Well, yeah.
We create our own reality, and we create all aspects of that reality.
Well, I don't know how much I create in terms of my reality. I think that I'm like right now I'm on this stage with you, and no one is seeing this live. Whenever you hear my voice, this is taking place on a certain day and time before you see it.
Okay.
Our normal thing is you and I are having this conversation, but this thing can conceivably air forever.
Yes.
It'll be there. And if the tape survives or the digital survives, and there we are. So there's some of that. And I'm really aware that my role is to be here now in this particular time and space.
Exactly.
Even though I feel like I'm more of a guy from the 1900s or the 20th century because I spent most of my life in it. But now as we tape this, we're 10 years into the new millennium.
But again...
What's time, huh?
That's another question. But I mean, what I think I'm trying to say is that we have the ability to heal ourselves, to bring to us that which we need to heal, to bring to us that which what we need to teach, or teach us more specifically. My experience has been is when I let go of, as best as I can, self-will, I am given huge amounts of guidance, that I'm given teachers at the exactly right moment, and then it's just up to me to recognize I'm not supposed to walk away from this. And I think it's my willingness to be taught that brings them to me, because there was periods in my life where there was no willingness and nobody was presented to me.
Well, isn't that kind of natural or normal?
I believe so, but I believe that's also divine.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything that you said in that regard, and I'm often taken by that. I noticed that of late, those moments before awakening become more where you're half asleep or you're more asleep than you are awake, and you become aware of it. Is an interesting time, and I think most of the religious practices that I've experienced or studied, often revere that time. Like I spent time at the Benedictine monastery in Abiquiu, Christ in the Desert, and they're up and at 'em by 4 a.m. So they're up by 3:30 or whatever, and they're in there starting to pray and meditate at 4, and then they take a break around 5 or something. It's still dark. Mm-hmm. So what are you going to do? And they're saying the Psalms that are obviously, thousands of years old. Psalms, I would imagine. I don't know when they're written, but a long time ago. And they say all 150 of them within a week. And they sing them to each other, back and forth, kind of a thing, and they do that. And then you go take a break. And I remember this last time I was out there was a few years ago, and I didn't get it until then. I laid down on a couch just waiting for the next round of meditation to come, and boy, it just had an effect on me. And I asked Abbot Philip about that, and the prior, Father Christian, and they said there have been studies done about what it does to your head, your brain waves, and that sort of thing. And I love the blending of all that stuff, the science that comes around to support these kind of spiritual things, because we're learning a lot all the time. We're learning a lot. And I want to go back to something else that you mentioned before I forget. How much time we got left?
Got 10 minutes.
Oh boy, it did race by. Did you ever read the book by Carolyn Mays, The Anatomy of the Spirit?
No.
I wanted to lionize her because she was the first person I know that took the teachings of the Kabbalah, the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church, and the 7 body chakras, and integrated them in a book. so that all of a sudden now, because it's like, when you first heard Willie Nelson talking about karma, well, okay, Willie, if he starts talking about karma, that means you and I can talk about karma in that sense. In other words, somebody writes a book about something, then in this book, and they talked about the 7 sacraments, the 7 body chakras, and the Kabbalah, the different frames of reference there, all in one context. So that's 3 different traditions right there, just sort of like circling, almost like the caduceus around the spinal column and whatever that is.
Well, I mean, that goes to Aldous Huxley, the perennial philosophy, that at the basis of every religion, he's got 7 major, that there are 7 major points that he'd made about they were all teaching the same thing. So I think everything that we do, everything is leading up to borrow our topic, awakening the spirit for that revolution. And it doesn't matter what the practice is. It's just about, am I reaching in, am I looking in for that spirit, and am I trying to awaken it, and what is that going to bring about?
That's true.
And that's why I like that topic by the Dalai Lama. I mean, he wasn't telling us convert to Tibetan Buddhism. He's saying spiritual revolution, just go inside. And I think that's what every religion is taught, go inside.
Well, in Christianity, the only time they use it first is seek first the kingdom of God, and then all things will be added unto you. And then they take from the Jewish tradition the highest commandment, which is what? To love with your whole heart, love with your whole soul, and love with your whole mind. In that order, I believe. That's right out of I think I'm paraphrasing from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 4 through 10. In chapter 5, they give the 10 commandments. And then in 6, they go, and those are, great guidelines to follow. And then once you've kind of mastered those, then this next one is more metaphysical. Because how do you love with your whole heart? How do you love God that way? Well, first of all, you can't love God that way unless you love yourself first. And how do you love yourself like that? I prayed about it, and my guidance came through, and it said, the first level of love is forgiveness. You have to forgive yourself first for everything. Real or imagined. And so start forgiving yourself for everything, and then forgive others. And so I worked with it for a while, and it worked fine until I came to somebody that I couldn't forgive, and I was devastated. Oh, man. What's the old Chinese saying? Journey of 1,000 miles is the first step. So I started, and it worked for a while, and then I came to somebody who I couldn't forgive, and I wanted to, but I couldn't. So I took it back to prayer, meditation, went inside, and asked, and the guidance came through. Have compassion for yourself first in whatever dilemma you're faced with. And then once you have compassion for yourself, when I started doing it, I just said it over and over. I forgive myself, have compassion for myself, literally just said it over and over until I could literally feel my heart chakra starting to fill. And the truth was, man, I'd never felt that before. And I kept saying it over and over like a mantra, as a mantra, japa yoga, mantra yoga, saying it over and over until, honest to God, for the first time in my life, my heart was overflowing. And in that, then have compassion for the person. Well, I could have compassion, no problem. My heart's overflowing. Man, it was easy. It was a cakewalk, and the forgiveness came next. So forgiveness and compassion, I think, are essential ingredients to have that love, which is the highest commandment in all of Christianity. And it's under every mezuzah. I've got a mezuzah on my doorpost. I'm not Jewish. I took basic Judaism at the temple from Rabbi Hellman, but I think it's a great thing, and I touch it when I go out. Hear, O Israel, hear and obey. The Lord is your God, the Lord alone, and you shall love the Lord your God with your whole heart, your whole soul, and your whole mind. And then I'm paraphrasing the New American Bible, and it says, and I enjoin this on your heart today. Speak of it at home and abroad. Drill it into your children. Bind it on your forehead, around your forehead, at your wrist, and put it on your doorpost. And that's the only real imperative in this whole book.
And that comes down to the statement, kingdom of God is within, and that's the heart. We're running out of time. I want to do a couple of quick announcements, and then we're going to turn to you for a parting thought.
That was it, but go ahead.
So I just want to let everybody know that this is public TV, basically. This is your channel. This is your show. One of the things I'm interested in doing, and I'm looking for somebody in the audience who's watching, maybe want to come forward. I want to do a show on Edgar Casey. So anybody thinks they have a particular expertise or knowledge and would like to talk about it, my contact information has been flashing and will run again at the end of the show. Also, Bill and I were talking, and was it you? Or, no, maybe it was right before you got there with Archbishop Gundry. I'd like to talk about, I want to do a show with people who have had experiences where they were not happy with the religion of their parents and what they've done about it and what they do now. And I'm just looking for anybody. So if you're interested, contact me and I'll try to put together a panel on that. And just to let you know, next week, my guest is Rabbi Marvin Schwab, who is the head of the Temple Beth Shalom here in Santa Fe. And we're going to talk about many aspects of Judaism. So keep tuning in. Parting thought, my good friend.
Well, I loved Edgar Casey. I volunteered to be on your panel. I was a member of the ARE, Association Research and Enlightenment. There's some great documentaries on Edgar Casey. He even wrote a book on Jesus that I thought was fascinating. But
the Jeffrey First.
Pardon?
The Jeffrey First book, the readings on Casey.
No, well, I don't know this, but this was titled Casey on Jesus, on the story of Jesus. But
yeah, that was it.
Anyhow, it wasn't quite popular, but I thought it was fascinating. And there's a lot of that to be developed. You know, I think we have those gifts of the Spirit, and I recommend everybody to read. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 lists the final place to look for a lot of the spiritual gifts. But then 13 is the definitive chapter on love. Because you got all the gifts, all the power. You have not love, you got nothing. And then it goes on. The first line of 14 says, "So make love your great quest, then desire spiritual gifts for the help of your fellows." To help others. So it's a great pursuit.
And that pursuit will lead to a spiritual revolution.
Yeah, if you change yourself first.
I have to. I mean, I've said that on the air a number of times that, Jesus' commandment to love thy neighbor as thyself breaks down because we don't love ourselves. And what you had said, we cannot give away what we do not have. I can't give you love if I don't have it. Mm-hmm. And I believe I've got to find it not only within me, but find it. The only place I'm ever going to find unconditional love is through a connection to God. That's the only place that I've ever seen it demonstrated. That if it wasn't for God's unconditional love, I wouldn't be here. That's a whole other story for another time. But, if it was a God of damnation, I would have been damned. The things I had done. So, God is loving and caring and forgiving. And in the words of one of my teachers who's a Sufi master.
Who's that?
Maulana Sheikh Zainul Ibn Kazmi. He said that there are 99 attributes in the Quran to Allah, and the highest attribute is mercy. And I believe that. So, Bill, thank you so much for being a guest.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. Good luck with your program, and welcome to television after all years in radio.
Thank you. And same to you with your new show and your existing show. So until next week, know that in one form or another, you are divine, walk in love and light, and then demonstrate it. Blessings to you all.
I'm Rev Phil, and I've been your host for Words of the Prophets. Thank you for tuning in. Please join me again next week, same time, same channel, for more Words of the Prophets.